Hi, friends. Host Eric here, host of Talking with Famous People, and I'm here to discuss today typology and relationship fittedness. And the reason I'm discussing this is because Rachel asked me questions that were motivated by a conversation she had with Jake Forrest in what, for lack of a correct name for it, I will call the TWFP Discord. No such thing doesn't really exist, but it's basically that. Anyway, Jake Forrest was asking about INFJ and ENTP compatibility and raising some questions that I think she probably developed as a consequence of finding examples in her own life that seem inconsistent with what's being said about the fundamental compatibility of INFJs and ENTPs. Well, the bottom line is this. It's never the case that two types are compatible or incompatible. It's always the case that two individuals are compatible or incompatible. And it's while typology can be informative about how or why that manifests, what's always going to be determinate in the compatibility issue are the particulars that are not typological. But let's look first at function compatibility or function stack compatibility. I'm going to use the ENTP and INFJ as an example because it's most easy for me to access from my own personal experience, and that's how I know things foremost. But these rules, the first two rules here and the three rules in general, apply to all intertype compatibility questions. So, typological compatibility has two vectors in it mostly: completeness/redundancy, and value in or incompatibility or compatibility. Now, if you look at INFJ and ENTP, what they have is mostly completeness rather than redundancy. So, in other words, INFJ's NI knowing isn't represented consciously in the ENTP stack. INFJ FE operational value is only third slot in the ENTP stack. And similarly, any absolute value for both types is only conscious in one of them, and the TI is only an absolute value in one of them and is operational in the other. So the thing about that is you have relative completeness because the ENTP is not going to be functionally effective at attending via FE and SI, and the INFJ is not going to be functionally effective at attending via TI and SE, but the TI and FE components there are covered by the other person. So that produces some completeness. However, there's redundancy in that both parties are using the same judging functions to decide things and interface with things. And so what matters in that regard is whether or not they're competing against each other or not. So if you're talking about an ESTP and an ENTP relationship compatibility, both of them are going to be utilizing TI as an operational value, and both of them are going to be utilizing FE as an absolute value. But ultimately, that means both of them are going to expect to do TI to get FE, and neither party's going to provide that. Whereas with the flip of the 2-3, you get provision from the other party on the grounds you want to be provided for. When Rachel demonstrates FE grace, I value it as an absolute rather than simply to do something. Similarly with correctness or fairness in reverse for us. So that you're talking about completeness and redundancy then kind of bleeds into value and compatibility, but you can imagine a scenario where an ISFP and an ENTP get together. They've got full completeness and no redundancy. They share no conscious functions, and one's an introvert, one's an extrovert. That would comprise a complete attentional, all 8 functions consciously represented, and it would also comprise value compatibility, but a lack of redundancy means a difficulty in finding bridges between the two frames of reference. So, while ISFP and ENTP may share the same absolute and instrumental values, unlike INFJ and ENTP, the ISFP has no bridge to pay the ENTP because they're ignoring FE, and the ENTP has no bridge to pay off the NI of the ISFP because the ENTP is ignoring NI. So one can conceive of, however, a relationship in which the two parties are both working together on a project, like a life project, not just a temporary thing. Let's say they're both archaeologists, and they've delegated to each party in the relationship all the work that is specific to that's appropriate for their cognitive function stack. Then both parties could grow over time to view the other as an incredibly invaluable, their better half, their other half, you know? However, that's where we get down into the particulars. So, the reason Rachel and I are so compatible, in part, can be explained by typology, but in a larger part can be explained by our particulars. We're in a circumstance that requires of us very little SE and TE kind of practicality. If Rachel and I were moving through the world, a world that required of us a lot of practicality, on grounds that neither of us is particularly empowered to exercise such practicality, then the relationship would be much more challenging to sustain because both parties would begin to feel like they can't count on their significant other to handle shit that otherwise can't get handled. So you could argue that ISFJ and ENTP provides a more complete approach towards the world because ISFJ and ENTP have no areas that need bridging. So they share all the same conscious stack, and one party is like the grounded half and one party is the metaphysical half. This, though, we get to number 3 ultimately, is why it's always determined by the particulars. There may have been a time in my life when I was ideationally needing a lot of grounding and pressure, and where I might have been responsive to pressure directing my energies towards more practical matters. I was in a relationship with an ISFJ for about 2.5 years, and what it ended up playing out like is the ISFJ directing my creative and otherwise action energies towards things that were non-metaphysical things. She wanted me to build a chicken coop in the backyard, which I did. Like, I built a little house from ground up out of reclaimed wood that we found around the neighborhood and stuff, and it was the most impressive TESE thing I've ever done, probably. And yet, while I found it satisfying to complete that when it was done, I was surprised and impressed at my ability to pull it off, and I had to acknowledge that it wouldn't have come out nearly anywhere close to as good without the irrational, you missed the spot nitpickiness of the ISFJ. It nevertheless, from an objective overhead view, was not a good use of my time. In other words, that would be fine in a world where I and my partner are homesteading. Then it's true that the ENTP needs to be reined in their metaphysicality and have their energies directed towards practical considerations, because that's the job of the couple as a whole, is to make their way in this homestead environment where they've got to be very self-reliant. If I were homesteading, I'd probably be better served to be with an ISFJ than an INFJ as a consequence, because it's presuming in those particulars a world where it's not ready for an ENTP yet, and it's not really ready for an INFJ. It's a world that requires a lot more sensory kind of practicality than either the INFJ or the ENTP can provide. So the thing is, in our current reality, Rachel came to join me, and we made this relationship, and it's been incredibly smooth sailing. There's been zero value incompatibilities, and what we can both count on and rely upon is that when either of us screws up in ways that are harmful on practicality grounds, that we're not going to get judged or pushed by the other person towards behaving more in a more holistically validating fashion, but rather be validated in our lack of holistic approach. Because of my circumstances and because of our circumstances, this relationship is incredibly peaceful and rewarding for both of us, because the world is incredibly peaceful and coddling of both of us. Without that factor, it would be a lot more challenging. So it's impossible to determine ultimately the ideal relationship partner in terms of compatibility without considering the particular situation in which the relationship is going to manifest. In the status quo, Rachel and I do have a problem that stems from our cognitive function stacks, extreme compatibility, which is because we're both the most metaphysical types, which means we're the least correct about our individual particular selves. When we are afforded the autonomy that our current situation affords us, namely the ability to play around and do whatever we want, really, but without a lot of resources to play big ideas out in physicalities, we discover that we don't take nearly as good advantage of that opportunity to manifest in the ways in which we are both enthusiastic and compatible in manifesting than we'd like to. There's a sense of a lack of self-discipline that makes us wonder if we're really living as we ought to, or just waiting to die. This is a problem because you've got two parties who understand the things on the biggest picture, largest frame, most universalist frame, and that's never how life plays out. In the actual reality of day-to-day living, it's never about these abstract ideas and they're cascading down. It's always about, we're out of coffee creamer and we need to go get more, and we're also kind of broke, and so when we go to the store we should just get coffee creamer and a couple other things and not a bunch of stuff, and then it's like that. That's how reality plays out on the day to day. It comprises lots of little requirements slash achievements slash failures slash whatever, and if it's maximally understood as such, then you're talking about SI tool. What I do to try to improve purposefulness for both of us is to recall that something I talked about with Aga yesterday, which is it really depends on how you start the day for an ENTP, or how you start the whatever. Today I got off to a good start. I knew Rachel and I had this conversation about purpose and like a sense of emptiness that comes from just being and consuming without meaningfully impacting the world with our actions. For Rachel, she wants to see real world impacts and cause real world impacts that are significant. She caused, in an amazing fashion, she made happen this incredible life change for herself, where she went from this really messed up situation that she was living in New York to being my wife and moving here, and it was one of the most, you know, impactful things she could possibly have done in terms of fixing her own life in one fell swoop. And she pulled it off by virtue of the fact that, you know, I was smitten right away. And I I never have regretted for a second being with Rachel. It's fantastic, right? It's fantastic because we never have trouble communicating. We always understand where each other's coming from. Whenever I have trouble communicating at all, it's because I'm talking about something too mushy to communicate about. When Rachel asked me the other night about her Enneagram type, I found it very frustrating because as I started to to try to explain, like, well, it's a hard question to answer. There really isn't a good answer for it, and what she had uncovered there in that moment was a reality that she's going to run afoul of as an INFJ, which is she's open to receiving truths and understanding implicitly how they fit with big picture questions and cascade down. But that means when people are presenting or throwing out a lot of NI style cascading map truths and they don't cascade, it causes her an epistemological like cold. You know, it causes her epistemological COVID. And so then when I am trying to answer these questions or deal with what she's talking about later on, I start getting a little bit frustrated and irritated at people's haphazard use of language and how it's impacting Rachel negatively as a receiver. If some of the footballs you're throwing her to catch are covered in honey or covered in poo, then she's going to end up with honey and poo all over her rather than just catching balls. So the thing is, sometimes this can cause me even to lash out, especially if I'm live streaming. Sometimes Rachel will play sick'em, consciously or unconsciously, about some bullshit she's heard so that I can address it on the live stream. And then, you know, I come in like a ton of bricks on whatever it is I'm disagreeing with or finding to be bullshit. So maybe Peter Dentici gets steamrolled because he's an Enneagram guy who doesn't understand that you can't treat it like that. And so then I just hammer to try to make the point that you're doing damage when you're casting around a bunch of random cascading ideas that don't cascade and that you don't know how to present intellectually correctly, because mapping is an intellectual process. You can holistically understand things, but you can't holistically explain things. So when people who are eager to explain things do so in ways that are not compatible with the truth, ultimately, it causes an INFJ a lot of frustration because they go in fundamentally credulous, open to hearing how holistic things that are not explainable nevertheless cascade down. But it turns out that for most of the kinds of things that we're talking about, for it to be holistically correct, it needs to be explainable as well, or isolated in your explanation such that its holistic non-parsability doesn't infect things around it. This means sometimes in a live stream I hammer Enneagram, or the other day I really hammered on human design. And I said, because Rachel's trying to understand this human design thing, and it's causing her distress because as she's understanding holistically what the mapping things are going to do to cascade down, and then she starts to understand the cascadings, they run afoul of each other all the time. There's a lot of inconsistency, which means she's never getting paid off from a TI third slot perspective on what's correct and having gotten the right answer and being validated by a parsing approach. And instead, she's just confused and or annoyed by the fact that these are false paths being thrown in front of her. Now, the thing is, obviously, there are individual people who are promoting some of these ideas in the Discord server or something. And while I try generally not to attack the people, when I'm attacking something that they hold dear as an explanation, they're unavoidably going to feel attacked. So, the thing is, this is kind of not really related to intertype compatibility, but explains perhaps why, if you're somebody who's a significant player in the community around here, and you're particularly fond of treating NI as instrumental, namely, there's an endless succession of vague NI bullshit that replaces genuine explanation because it provides categories that you can fit yourself into. Well, then you've got human design. So it's like there's no logic to it. It's basically, as I described in that live stream, a bunch of aborted fetuses stapled together, and you go, there, now it's a living person. But it was never, you never had any possible chance of making a living person out of just trying to integrate every failed NI, or, successful only within its frame, or failed NI explanation of reality, from the I Ching to astrology to whatever else. You just push them all together into a big pile of wrongnesses and say, there, now that we've included all of the wrongnesses, we're right. Except that's not how shit works at all, right? And it's a very anti-polar kind of relationship with the truth. Human design is. It's saying, truths don't have to be, singular, complete, holistic, or anything. You can just staple them together randomly, and you'll find out that it's even better than when they mean things specifically. So, I looked at human design for 5 seconds a while back, quite a ways back, and I immediately was just like, oh, this is complete garbage. This has zero credibility at all. But for a knower who's really distant from her own individual particulars, more so even than the ENTP, because, INFJ only has that linkage to physicality through an extroverted sensing function in the conscious stack, which means it doesn't creep into their epistemology at all. None of the particulars do. They don't really know who they themselves are, what they want, or how to take care of themselves physically and be comfortable and stuff. And they never will. So it's instead what they try to do is to understand as fully as possible the totality of things, such that those attentional deficits don't end up biting them in the ass. Of course, what that means is they're always trying to understand themselves by working around the natural ways to understand yourself, SI and FI. Those are your particularist epistemology functions that let you know how you genuinely, authentically feel, and that means both physically and emotionally. FI with the emotions, SI with the physicalities, and it means SI and the particulars of what you've done and what you plan to do. What's ahead for us for the day? When I wake up in the morning, if I'm maximally effective, I've got some kind of map for the day ahead of me and some kind of criterion in place that says if I do a good job today, I'll hit the ground running and come out of the gate with accomplishing a few things of the following nature. And then the rest of the day after that can be if I don't get more things of particular value done, then at the very least I can know that the things I've already done earlier in the day are put into the bank. Rachel, being an INFJ, is looking ideally to not have to know what she wants to do and what she's doing, and nevertheless be included in all the activities in ways that she finds satisfying. Being an INFJ, you don't have to do a lot of super exciting shit for her to find it satisfying. In fact, you've got to kind of manage the reality of the other party's S cautiously. Rachel is constantly expressing concern, not constantly, but periodically expresses concern since her disabling toxic drug interaction, which caused her neuropathy, has impacted her ability to physically keep up in various kinds of things from how she was before that. So it's a very dramatic, striking, life-changing event that occurred, and she worries that, well, she's not going to be able to keep up with the things I want to do. Well, the fact is, I don't want to do the kind of things she can't keep up with anyway, so it doesn't matter. But that's where both of our fourth slot functions can make a big difference if we're inclusive of the other person in the right ways. It's very important that I don't push Rachel too hard, and always has been, even before the disabling event. She's got a certain amount of SE she wants to do, and beyond that, she goes rapidly downhill into, okay, now I'm not happy. It's because she's an INFJ, it kind of hits her all of a sudden, in the same way that being hungry hits me all of a sudden. That she realizes that what was perfectly fine up until 5 minutes ago is now totally unbearable. And so because we're both mapping types, though, we have a kind of unique advantage. Because we're both disinterested in our calculi about our particulars, ourselves, and what we want, what's in our interests, we're especially good at talking about and mapping out how to maximally or most optimally manifest as a couple and as individuals. Of course, it takes us a long time to realize that kind of problem needs to be mapped out. COVID was extremely disruptive to everybody, and prior to the start of COVID, Rachel and I were living a certain kind of life that changed fundamentally once COVID hit, and that compelled us to be much more SFJ in our habits and values, but the values never change. So it's like the person who's most comfortable during COVID is the person who really is satisfied by staying home, watching a bunch of stuff, eating, drinking, being comfortable, and not feeling any deficit in terms of purpose or role in the world. These role in the world concerns are non-particularist, and we all get this, in that when we're in our most particularist moments, each of us recognizes that big picture things don't really matter in that moment. If I'm really sick and in bed, I'm not worried about whether or not I've gotten enough work done today to feel like I didn't just waste my life, right? I'm instead just thinking, I'm happy to be here in this bed where I'm neither shivering nor sweating and lying horizontally and not requiring anything of myself. So the question then is, does the relationship ultimately exist in a world and in a circumstance that doesn't create jagged edges between the people that are caused by the respective deficit areas of each party, while concurrently providing opportunities for the respective strength areas to be rewarded. We're built into that latter bit automatically by virtue of the fact that we're talking with famous people, and it's got a long history of built up engagement with multiple parties across the world about this subject, and about which we have the claim of exclusive correctness that any smart person would agree is appropriately claimed. It's not like there are alternative understandings of typology that can meaningfully claim to have a better map, because to do that they'd need to validate against universalist or mapping metrics, or what you might call criteria, or else you're just saying I prefer this map for particular reasons, even though that's not how we evaluate maps. So we are in place to make big impacts from our correctness about this sort of thing. And yet it's also true that when I go to make videos and when I go to make shorts and everything, part of my process a lot of times is playing it out and seeing how it goes. And including Rachel in a lot of these things requires me to have a clearer understanding of what she's going to be doing in the thing than I probably do when I feel the inclination to start doing it. So it's important for me then to be mappy and remember that including that INFJ worldview and the respective attentional strengths of her function stack improves everything we do. It's just the compatibility makes it such that if I don't include her in a creative project, she's never going to criticize me for it, and she doesn't want to be a burden, because we're both contraindicative towards our own interests. And so ultimately what I'm saying is this: if you want to be an ENTP who has a good relationship with an INFJ, make sure that your lives allow for that. And that's true of any two types. Regardless of your function stack, if your lives don't allow for it, it won't work out well. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to eat plenty of cheese.